non-fiction. He has won numerous awards, the most recent of which is the Sahitya Academy. Sudeep Chakravarti is an author who writes non-fiction, essays, and short stories. His work has been translated into several Indian and European languages. Manu Pillai is an author and columnist, formerly Chief of Staff to Dr. Shashi Tharoor. He has worked at the House of Lords in Britain. His writings appear in leading publications. This is a special session presented to you by Shrey. If I may please have our delegates on stage. Maybe a minute among themselves to talk. Dr. Tharoor, Sudeep Chakravarti, and Manu Pillai on stage. Over to Manu.
Thank you for your patience. We're running a little late, partly because we were running around in circles around Victoria Memorial trying to figure out what way to get in from. Anyway, without further ado, I think I'll go straight into the conversation. We've got two writers here who've both written history books. Neither of them were originally, I think, none of them set out to be historians. They've both, however, found their way into writing about historical subjects. And the two books are rather different. Dr. Tharoor's, if you may remember, in 2017 came out as this very sharp, almost an attack on the whole enterprise that was empire and colonialism. Whereas Sudeep's book on the Battle of Plassey, which is his newest, it's just out in the market. The book is, interestingly, for a battle which you would think is going to be about a very quick sort of racy read. It's actually a meditation on what led to the battle and the plots and the intrigues and the disgruntled begums and a very rich cast of characters, which makes it a very interesting study on something already pretty, we all learn about it in our textbooks, which is the Battle of Plassey. I'll start with Dr. Tharoor, since given what the topic is what it is. I think the first question would be why in 2017, almost out of the blue, did you end up writing this book called The Era of Darkness? I worked with you then, so I partially know the answer, but for the benefit of the audience.
Well, actually, I feel they know the answer too, because I spoke about this book. The book came out in October 2016, so in January 2017, I was right here on the stage with a large number of Calcuttans talking about the book. But let me just say that it came out of this debate I did at the Oxford Union in Oxford University. They had invited me to speak on the topic of Britain owes reparations to her former colonies. And though I was never particularly fond of the idea of reparations, I decided that it was a good opportunity to showcase what was wrong with British colonialism, at least in India. And so I took on the opportunity to do that. As you know, a few weeks later, the Union posted the video on YouTube, and my portion just went completely viral. We had, I think, after I tweeted it, we had 3 million downloads in the first 24 hours. And so my publisher, was also Sudeep's publisher, David Davidar, called me and said, listen, you've got to make this into a book. And I said, don't be silly, everyone knows this already. And he said, you're wrong, because if they knew it already, your speech wouldn't have gone viral, which seemed to me to make some sense. And so I was persuaded to transform what was a 12 or 12-minute speech, largely off the cuff and particularly full of responses to arguments that the other side had been making, into a well-researched, substantiated, heavily footnoted volume. And in so doing, I wrote not a narrative history, but an argument. The entire book is structured to demolish any of the defenses that have been advanced for the awful enterprise of British colonialism in India, to dissect them one by one, to take them apart, to portray the lasting damage done by colonialism. And therefore the book came in, if you like, at a moment when apparently even the Brits were ripe for a rethink, because up to that point we'd been seeing an appalling amount of glossing over of colonial history in Britain. They weren't, for example, teaching colonialism in their schools. You could do an A levels in history, the highest qualification, high school qualification in England, without learning a line of colonial history. There was no museum to colonialism. There were plenty of museums celebrating the glories of the imperial era. And there were gauzy soap operas on television, romanticizing the Raj. But the result was that there was a polling organization called YouGov, which issued a poll a few months, in fact, while I was writing the book or just about finishing it, that said that 59% of young people in Britain thought the empire was a good thing and would love to have it back, which in many ways helped me understand the moral urgency of setting the record straight. You won't find 59% of Germans saying Hitler was a good thing. So clearly, the Brits had been lacking in some honesty towards themselves. And so both in India, where the book struck a chord and is, at the risk of some immodesty, the highest selling hardback non-textbook of all time in this country, and it's still selling in hardback. All the thousands of paperbacks you see around are pirated, I'm sorry to say. So if you have a paperback of Era of Darkness, you are supporting piracy. Throw it away. But anyway, the fact is that I think it did strike a chord here. And then, to my pleasant surprise, the British edition, which had an even blunter title, Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India, that actually reached the bestseller list in a couple of newspapers. So it was to that degree a book of the moment. I'm somewhat surprised to be still discussing it 3 years later in Calcutta, but since that's what the organizers wanted, here we are.
It's interesting, the British edition was called Inglorious Empire, and while it did receive a lot of interesting reviews, including some, I think, academic quibbles about certain things, it certainly has sparked a very large conversation around colonialism. And now Priyamvada Gopal's produced a book called Insurgent Empire.
And there's this professor who's now come up with a calculation for how much the British Empire actually cost, which is an astonishing sum of 45 trillion pounds. Given that the entire British economy is 3 trillion, I don't think reparations are a meaningful enterprise in that context. But there is a discussion, a re-examination, and it's interesting how far it's reached. I had mounted a bit of a campaign to get them to apologize. That didn't happen at the right moment, which would have been the centenary of Jallianwala Bagh. But we did get the British Prime Minister standing up in the House of Commons and expressing regret, which is more than any of her predecessors were able to do. I still think they could have sent Harry and Meghan Markle to go on their knees in Jallianwala Bagh before disposing of them, but alas, they didn't have the imagination to do that. Because, after all, everything was done in the name of the Crown, so an apology from the Crown. No politician is going to comfortably say sorry in a parliamentary system where you can easily be pilloried for that. Though I do point out in my foreword to the book that Willy Brandt, who as the Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany, had nothing to do with the Nazi excesses and was himself a victim of them, actually fell on his knees in the Warsaw Ghetto as an act of apology and atonement on behalf of the German people, whose prime minister he was, whose chancellor he was. That sort of gesture, sadly, even that was 1970 that Brandt did that. Sadly, even 50 years later, no British political leader has found the courage to be able to do.
Sudeep, your book is interesting. Dr. Tharoor referred to the price of colonialism, the kind of wealth that was looted out of India. One of the most sensational moments when that actually began was Plassey. That was one of the first battles where that kind of gold and treasure was actually put into boats and sailed away all the way to England. But when I was I'm doing a review of the book, and it'll be published soon. It's already written before we met, so there's no conflict of interest. But when I was reviewing the book, I was telling a friend, and he said, another Bengali talking about Plassey, what a cliche. But in fact, the way you approach Plassey isn't a cliche. You've actually not only looked at multiple sources, you've not only dissected multiple sources, you've sort of tried to explain all the sort of backroom work that happened and that led up to Plassey. What made an ex-journalist, someone who's written the Bengalis, and this is your first book of pure history, as it were. What brought you here?
Well, I was always keen on getting a hyphenation of historian added to journalist, author, historian, so I guess I'm there now. But I must thank Dr. Tharoor for one thing straight away. We share publishers, and I'm very happy that The Era of Darkness did so well, because it enables people like me to get published by Aleph. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm not complaining at all. May your books sell forever, and inshallah, may my books too. But thank you very much. As to coming to Plassey, the battle that changed the course of Indian history, It's actually a very fruitful segue from a book that I published just one book earlier called The Bengalis, also with Aleph, in which I discuss several threads to who the Bengalis are, what we are, where have we come from, our momentous moments, if you will, our time under the sun, which includes the Battle of Plassey, which, and I was very keen to see that the way propaganda has it, or the way latter-day agitprop has it, Siraj-ud-Daulah, who was not a Bengali, was very conveniently transformed by later-day history from the last free Nawab of Bengal, as is typically known, as the Bengali Nawab, which is far from the same thing. And more than my natural angst about the Commonwealth, which I think is an abomination, and there I'm in your part of the school, and so on and so forth, and the rage that I felt growing up and studying and unlearning my own history as I got older, I thought that, I mean, this was a good opportunity to take the threads that the sutras that I came across while writing the Bengalis and sort of run with it. Plassey was a very key sutra for me, a historical sutra, a terrific sutra which involved not just Bengal, not just Eastern India, not just the East India Company, but we also forget that France was involved in a very, very deep sense. We forget that the Mughals were involved. We forget the Pathans were involved. We forget the Dutch were involved. They nearly beat the British at the Battle of Chinsura 2 years after Plassey. So I mean, the deeper I went into it, the more threads I discovered. And it just went so far beyond the mythology of Plassey. Patriotic Siraj, traitorous Mir Jafar, crafty Clive. This was the broad contours of Plassey. But it was necessary to go deeper into that, and it was just such an adventure to just research the book and to go into it. I'm so very happy to have written it. And I think it's a story that needs to be told, much like we're a bit of an Empire Writes Back kind of panel, because young Manu has been doing some fine work writing about histories located in southern India and central India. And I think these are the stories that what Dr. Tharoor started a bit of a gold rush for for general history writing, and then Manu has been at it. I'm very happy to join the party, if you will. And I think these kind of stories need to be told. We need to understand who we are. We need to understand where we've come from, and we need to understand how close we were to actually having this book written in French, or me or us speaking in French, then speaking in English and writing in English. Very, very interesting to look at these aspects as well.
You also have this other argument in the book, and it's come up in several books now, about how, you gave the broad contours of the story, the battle, Mir Jafar, betrayal, and that was that. And Siraj is sort of this, this hero who falls. But the battle really appears only towards the end of the book. All of the rest of the book is a build-up to the battle, and there's so much economics in it, economic interest. The bankers who thought that they were going to replace Siraj and put in place a company that they would then sort of maneuver and control. None of that worked out that way. I really want you to talk a little bit about the whole economic interests that made Plassey happen.
Okay. And thank you for saying that. I mean, we must not forget that it was, after all, the British East India Company, and it was the French East Indies Company, the Dutch East Indies Company. These were corporate enterprises that looked to do business in this part of the world, as in Batavia, in Jakarta, as elsewhere in the world, in Africa, in North America, so on and so forth. Now, the interesting aspect is that what I discovered, much to my delight, was that Robert Clive, even before he conspired with Mir Jafar and the Jagat Seth of the day, and other people who I hope you read about,
bankers, of course.
The great bankers, the bankers to the world. What is interesting is that it's in the book. I mean, there's a letter that Clive wrote saying that we must destroy Chandranagar. We must absolutely demolish the French because the French were between Kolkata and Plassey. And if he went on to destroy Siraj, or in a coup d'etat remove Siraj, which was a business decision. It was not necessarily a warlike decision. It was a decision of business enterprise that they would have Chandranagar to their back as they went forward towards Murshidabad and Plassey. So it was very necessary to bump off to totally demolish the French in Chandranagar, which is why the Battle of Chandranagar took place. And it was all a business plan. The East India Company and His Majesty's government worked together. Admiral Watson was a admiral of the Royal Navy. Robert Clive was was commissioned by the East India Company. The forces came together. They came together. He ruled the waters. Robert Clive had land, and they went together as Crown and Company, as a business proposition to get rid of Siraj-ud-Daulah. Plassey was a business decision. It was a business battle as much as a battle on the field of battle.
In fact, William Dalrymple in his new book basically says the Jagat Seths gave them a large sum of money. That the Jagat Seths apparently had fallen afoul of Siraj-ud-Daulah, or his provincial chaps were extorting more money from the Jagat Seths and even threatening to put them in jail and so on. So these chaps said, fair enough, we'll teach him a lesson. We'll pay the British a decent sum of money to knock him off. And that Mir Jafar was essentially a mere agent of a much larger financial deal. The Jagat Seths thought they'd make more money with the British ensuring a stable Bengal rather than Siraj-ud-Daulah, who in Dalrymple's telling is not a hero, but a very venal, corrupt, egotistical, badly behaved and capricious fool.
I think William is taken after the company telling, and I wish to bring it up with him in Jaipur when I meet him on Saturday. But it's an interesting point, and that was certainly a deal. And there's a telling that goes, which many of you have read and know about, that Siraj-ud-Daulah demanded 30 million rupees from Jagat Seth, and when Jagat Seth denied it, because it was expensive to run the administration, the exchequer was broke, so on and so forth. And Jagat Seth Madhabrai denied it, and Siraj, so goes the story, slapped him in open darbar. And he could never forget that. And this has actually been corroborated by East India Company documents. So it's not quite the pie in the sky that it was made out to be in sort of Plassey lore. So there are many such instances that pepper the dramatis personae of Plassey and the backstory of Plassey.
Dr. Tharoor, it's interesting that economic interests, interestingly, supported by Indian entities and Indian interests and so on, they're the ones who actually ended up supporting Plassey, thinking that they would then continue to control the fate of what happened thereafter, but they didn't. And then you have the Raj come in, and one of the big aspects of your book is the economics of it, the fact that this was not about bringing civilization to India, this was about the money. And that's a case you make pretty compelling.
Yeah, I mean, as Sudeep rightly points out, this was a commercial enterprise at the very start. I mean, the East India Company was established in 1600. So they've been around for 150 years making money. But, you come to trade, you want to basically compete against other Western companies that are also trading in the same goods. And then you discover that if you can trade at the point of a gun, you kind of do better. That's essentially what happened with the East India Company. They started acquiring troops, including locally engaged sipais, essentially to make money. And, this had been going on for some time, as I said, but if you take, for example, that the governor of Madras, as he was called in 1702, Thomas Pitt, actually acquired one diamond, some stories say from the eye of an idol or the forehead of an idol in the temple. That diamond alone, when shipped back to Europe and sold to the Duke of Orleans, actually made him the richest man in England, enabled him to buy a magnificent mansion under Rottenborough constituency, and two of his descendants went on to become prime ministers of England in the same century, William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, and William Pitt the Younger. And this happened on the basis of a fortune acquired in 1702, so well before Plassey. So, I mean, the East India Company had been in money. There's a letter I quote in Era of Darkness from a young man of some obscurity writing to his father in the 1720s, saying that the one place in the world where an Englishman of no accomplishment or talent can make a fortune is India. And this is an actual letter found in the archives. I mean, I wasn't doing the archival research that Sudeep and others have done. I was quoting secondary sources and journal articles, but here you are. There's plenty of evidence for the nakedly commercial motives. And that was the great misfortune of British rule. You see, loot undoubtedly happened before the British. Rulers were rapacious, Siraj-ud-Daulah and others, but they spent the proceeds of their loot in India. So there were roads and bridges and sarais. There were entire flourishing sort of industries of jewelry and fancy cloth and artisans and so on. So even if rule and power, political power, meant the domination and exploitation of people, which certainly was not always the case, but was sometimes the case, at least it merely meant a redistribution within India of the wealth. Whereas with the East India Company, it was about draining the money out of India and taking it back to England. There was minimal investment in infrastructure, in anything beyond what was essential to maintain British power, and the rest was just naked rapacity. And it went on and on and on for a ridiculously long time. And as Sudeep also pointed out with his reference to Admiral Watson, the British government was complicit in the exercise. See, they tried to have it both ways. They talk about the great civilizing mission, which is an argument that only came in the second half of the 19th century. But they also say, well, we are really not responsible for the excesses of the East India Company because that was a private enterprise. I mean, not so. The British were complicit at every stage as a government. The so-called Governor-General, appointed by the East India Company, was appointed with the knowledge and complicity of the government. And large numbers of members of parliament actually owned shares in the East India Company. And as a result, there was this, if you like, this was a collective extortion racket. It wasn't just a handful of people. The writer Walpole takes a carriage down a street in England, in London in the 1790s, and literally recounts building after building built with Indian money. He describes London as a sinkhole of Indian wealth. So absolutely, Sudeep is right. This is an economic, purely sort of, I mean, it's really, not to put too fine a point, in a mafia-style operation. I think in one of your writings, Manu, you've talked about the way in which the British would offer essentially the same kind of deal as the mafia does, protection money, right? You go to a Raja and you say, oh, but you don't have any protection. The Raja says, I have no enemies, why am I worried? They say, but you might be attacked, so we're going to build 10,000 soldiers here, and you're going to pay us 100 lakh rupees or whatever every month, whatever. And the Maharaj says, why not? And he said, well, of course, if you don't do that, we might attack you. Whereupon he gets the message and he succumbs to the extortion racket. There have been multiple documented examples of such things. That's the kind of way in which the East India Company expanded its strength in India.
In fact, the extortion thing is interesting. It reminds me of Robert Clive's childhood. There's a letter, the contemporary records in a letter his uncle wrote suggests that as a young boy, he basically created a protection racket in the town in which he lived, and where he promised not to throw stones and smash the windows of shopkeepers, so long as they paid up. And if they didn't pay up, they all lost their windows. So clearly, I think he might have been the inventor of the idea and who imported it to India afterwards.
Absolutely. And they had the gall to call him Clive of India as if he belonged to the country, when all he really did was to ensure that much of the country belonged to him. But anyway.
The two of you have now, of course, talked about the economic aspect, and it is very compelling because even in today's politics, you see the links between the big business and big power. But what's also interesting is you can't really play down the force of personality either. I mean, Clive was a very important part of the puzzle there. If it was another leader, it might have been a different fate really in terms of how the battle would have turned out. Similarly, even in later periods, you have some viceroys who are relatively better to Indians and some who are not, and some like Macaulay who've done lasting damage to the country. So how much do you think in your respective books, in your own respective readings, how much does personality play a role in actually making sure that history goes one way or the other?
Very briefly, let me talk about Robert Clive, since you mentioned Robert Clive. I mean, again, not many people realize. I mean, he's painted as Dr. Tharoor said, Clive of India, Clive Baron Plassey. There are manors named after him. In Ireland, there is even a Plassey House, so on and so forth. But the two things people don't realize is just how messed up this young man was. After all, when he fought the Battle of Plassey, he was just 32. Let's not forget that. I mean, and Sirajuddaula was 24. There wasn't much of an age difference between the two. And Clive was this manic individual who continually kept getting nervous exhaustion. I mean, he was not this sort of bold lion of Bengal or lion of the company or anything of the sort. He was a bloody nervous wreck.
In fact, he was technically manic depressive, right?
And he took opium for it. These things are not known. And he was a wreck up until the day of the battle. He was a wreck during the battle. I quote letters where he's writing letters to Mir Jafar on 22nd of June in the afternoon, the day before the Battle of Plassey, which began at 8 in the morning, saying, I haven't heard from you. I mean, I can't do any more than what I've already done. And if I do not hear from you, I'm going to make peace with Siraj-ud-Daulah. This is Robert Clive one day before the Battle of Plassey. He was, there was a telling during the Battle of Plassey that he was up for so long, he was up for 48 hours non-stop, that he went to sleep, and he had to be woken up when one of the decisive moments in the battle took place where the company forces and the sepoys went forward against the Bengal army. This man was a wreck, and then after that, but he was clearly a schizophrenic wreck because he transformed himself effortlessly from wreck to a man who's very confident, to a man who's in two minds, to a man who's got this complete business outlay there. The man who actually single-handedly, with his bravado, gained for the East India Company the rich prize of the Suba of Bengal, Bihar, and not Orissa, because the Marathas had control of it, but the richest province in the empire at the time, the Mughal Empire. So this is a manic individual, and
Who
I
actually
think
shoots himself. In the end, he commits suicide.
yes, and look at that.
And he's buried in an unmarked grave
Yeah,
in the middle of the night. It's all very
And
mysterious.
Siraj is on the other hand, painted as this equally manic individual, by the way, but that's usually Clive was played up and Siraj is played down. But if you do the readings, they're probably equally manic, equally insecure, equally in two minds, very nervous before the battle and the lead up to the battle, very conscious of how weak their positions are in their respective domains. Very, very similar. Siraj apparently drank a lot and gave it up on the deathbed of his grandfather, Aligardi Khan. But otherwise, with the womanizing, with the gallivanting, and with the carousing, and the nervousness and the schizophrenia, pretty much Clive.
And you have this wonderful thing about his aunt who he didn't get along with, and how he went and deprived her of all her money and stripped her of her riches. And she, poor thing, gets drowned in a boat later by
Well, not by Siraj, but by
Mir Jafar.
Mir Jafar.
Yeah.
Oh, Mir Jafar's son,
Son,
actually.
yeah. Dr. Tharoor, I won't ask you the personality question, but now we saw that in Plassey, as Sudeep's book shows, there was a lot of Indian complicity. Big Indian enterprises, etc., were complicit in it. So it's not a black and white story. In your book, one of the criticisms that has come through is that the British Empire was, for many Indians, if not Indian elites, if not Indian kings, if not Indian power centers, for many Indians who are subaltern or Indians and marginalized Indians, the British Empire was a force that gave them access to a slightly more level playing field, slightly fairer situations. I'm talking about, say, Mahatma Phule, the grandson of a gardener who managed to get into a missionary school, and that's how he became who he did. Even in Ambedkar, for example. And Macaulay's birthday, everyone hates on Macaulay, but Macaulay's birthday is celebrated by many Dalits as Macaulay Jayanti because they quite appreciate the gift of the English language. So we have complicity in Plassey, but equally, even during the worst phase of the empire in India, clearly there were Indians who benefited from that system and from British law.
Okay, there are two levels of response. The first, of course, as far as the earlier period is concerned, is that undoubtedly there were people complicit, and the Marxists have talked about compradors and so on. There have been people in every colonial enterprise who have profited from association with the colonists, and that there is no country in the world of which that is not true, and India was no exception. If it was the Jagat Seths at the time of Plassey, it was certainly others later. And there are some very big families in Bengal whom we celebrate today who made their money as entrepreneurs, to put it politely, under the British and in supplying goods to the British. So that is a fact of life, and let's not move. Your larger point, and particularly applicable, I would say, to the later period, the sort of the last century of British rule, is a valid one, that for some historically subjugated communities, British education was available in a way that the equivalent kinds of education might not have been available. In other words, had we had a system in which Dalits and people of that sort of deprived background had the kind of access to the education system that was theoretically possible under the British, then perhaps social change could have come faster. And I'm not denying that argument, but I'm saying it is possible to overstate that argument. I'll give you 2 or 3 classic examples. We talk about Dalits, for example, but in a place like Travancore, where there was no British rule, you actually have the example of Mahatma Yankali, who himself never went to school, but became a major reformer for establishing schools and for the entry of Dalits into schools at a time when traditional society resisted, even burned down the first school into which Dalits were admitted. But he's able to fight through and win concessions for his community, independent of British frames of reference. It was between him and the Maharaja and the hidebound society of his area. And you saw similar movements elsewhere in what is at least theoretically non-British India. The second argument I would make is that there were always Indians also interested in justice and fair play. Let's not forget that Dr. Ambedkar's scholarships to study and go abroad and so on were paid for by the Maharaja of Baroda. And that this was something that was done, as far as I'm conscious, not particularly because it was a British encouraged thing to do. In fact, an awful lot of Indian education, of which there wasn't enough, was actually paid for and run by Indians. So the British would grudgingly give enough money for, say, one college. Indian benefactors would build 9. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy established 7 colleges in Bengal, where the British had set up only 1. So I do want to stress that we shouldn't back off from acknowledging some of the good things Indians also did that were not necessarily made possible by British largesse alone.
And on caste, in fact, we've got a long tradition of descent in Bhakti literature, which predates anything that's colonial. Now, coming to the final point, which I think is directly connected to the title of the session, you know, we live in times when there's lots of hyper-nationalism, there's a sense of seeking your identity. The country's still trying to figure out what our cultural, images, our self-images, we're trying to shape it. You know, we're all writers in the language that is English. Increasingly, there's all these debates that periodically come up on language, for example. But beyond that, on a broader level, what do you think this appetite for history that we're seeing at the moment, this appetite for history books, this appetite for, sort of understanding the Raj, even earlier histories, where do you think it stems from? Is it part of our, seeking out a cultural identity, or do you think it's just a healthy part of the evolution of our society? Both of you.
But you've answered the question brilliantly yourself by asking it the way you have. Sorry, were you?
No, I agree with you, Sudeep. I was going to say something similar, and that these two gentlemen are actually very much part of the cause. I mean, you can't just have an interest in history unless you've got something to help fuel it. And when you read histories written as entertainingly and insightfully as Manu's, and I'm sure Sudeep's, I have to confess, I haven't yet read the Plessy book, though it is on my shelf and is awaiting my attention. I would say that from what I've heard about his writing and about Manu's, what he's trying to now, Dalrymple is the other voice today, popular writing about Indian history has served 2 or 3 purposes. First, the books are good, they're well written, they're entertaining, so people enjoy reading them. Second, they're eye-opening, partly at a time when history has become part of contested territory in our contemporary politics, where interpretations and reinterpretations of the past are being peddled and fought over by major political parties. It would be interesting to have a version of history that is accessible to the non-scholar that helps shape your own opinions on these matters. So I'm not surprised, for example, that in the wake of the books we're talking about, you've seen volumes on Aurangzeb, volumes on Shivaji, volumes on Akbar, on Dara Shikoh. There's a lot of trying to rediscover that period of history, the pre-British period, because it helps us understand who we are today, who we might have been were it not for the British intrusion and all of that. So it seems to me what's going on is a very good thing. And let there be more of it, and may you continue to have a stellar career, both of you, as writers of history that Indians will actually read. I think language is a red herring. Your books can be easily translated into any Indian language that believes there's a sustainable market for it. But the fact is that economically viable publishing in India is essentially only in English and Hindi. And that's possibly because the kind of money it takes to be able to sustain a writer to do his research and travel and this and that is not, frankly, available merely from the sales of books. So you actually need a bigger ecosystem. And fortunately, I think all of us have had the privilege of being part of that.
Sudeep, anything before I open it up to the audience?
Yes, just a brief comment, really, because I would just like to take what Dr. Tharoor said and make it personal in that sense, because I have sensed all of this. And the reason why I know you are here to listen to Dr. Tharoor, so am I, by the way. No, so am I, for the record. But So now you better read my book. I have a copy for you there. But seriously, there is all of what Dr. Tharoor said. There is all of what Manu prefaced the question with. And when I talk to people at events like these, in occasions like these, elsewhere, in book signings, book readings, and Dr. Tharoor would have had far more experience of that than I. There is active interest that people want to take you away and argue with you. I just was accosted earlier today, ambushed really, by a young lady with annotated copy of Plassey, and she argued with me for 10 minutes as to why I had written this and not that, and why did I presume this and not, and I was absolutely blown away and so flattered that a small book that I've written, not that small, it just looks big, that would sort of generate that much of interest. Well done, and I'm very happy to continue writing, and thanks to you for enabling people like Manu and me to remain published.
Good to reclaim history, right in the shade of the Victoria Memorial. There's poetic justice there. But we'll open up to audience questions now, and I don't know if there's a mic going around, if there's a volunteer here. How does this work?
There's somebody clutching my book and raising his hand.
We'll go ladies first. Are there any ladies? There's a lady there in a black shirt.
But there's no one going around with a mic yet.
Yeah.
So where is that?
I don't see a mic. Yeah, I can
Ask
hear
anyway.
you.
We'll repeat your question for those who can't hear you. So the question is, if the British hadn't taken us over, would we have been taken over by the French or the Dutch or the Portuguese, and would we have been better off or worse off? I have my own views, but do you want to go first, the younger generation?
Well, I think we would have got a darn sight better bread and coffee in the subcontinent to begin with. And as I prefaced my comments earlier, we could have very well been having this conversation in French. And these books that Dr. Tharoor, Manu, and I have written could very well have been written in French. In fact, so close, in fact, is that the British themselves were surprised that after Plassey, up until the mid-1660s, 1760s, Calcutta was left undefended because the new Fort William was being built, the construction of which began after Plassey in 1758. And the British and the company and the crown were absolutely afraid that the French would sail in and take over Bengal. It was that close, and they were really surprised that they did not. The French were otherwise overextended in southern India. They were being attacked in Pondicherry and elsewhere in Africa and in Southeast Asia. But it is that close. So yes.
And the French had a problem. There was the 30 Years' War going on in Europe,
absolutely.
and not to mention America. And one should not forget that Dupleix was never really defeated. He was ordered by France to withdraw after the French lost in North America, and it was part of the settlement between the Brits and the French worldwide that the French
returned
will
the colonies, yes.
But no, let me answer your question both that way and different. On that one, I would say that of the various contenders, the Portuguese had been confined essentially to a handful of redoubts on the west coast. The Dutch had also, they had of course a presence in Kochi and one or two other places. Here they were in Serampore. But the territorial strengths of the Europeans in India were essentially between the Brits and the French. I'm inclined to think that the way history was evolving at the time, and particularly with the Industrial Revolution and the advantages of mechanization and so on, that probably you're right, we would not have stayed free of colonial rule. If it wasn't the English, it would probably have been the French. But I am allowed to indulge in a bit of counterfactual thinking and say, what if none of the colonists had succeeded? Maybe for whatever reason, including either succumbing to tropical disease, as nearly happened to Napoleon's French people in Italy, or merely the exhaustion that comes from what Sudeep has called overextension, which certainly affected the French more than the Brits. Let's say they hadn't made further inroads, what would have India been like? My inclination is to think that if you look at all the other indicators, the Marathas were probably the ones who would have consolidated control over India. They were only stopped from getting Bengal by the so-called Maratha ditch that the British built. In Delhi, there were large periods of time when the Mughal emperor was essentially their hostage. And I mean, they were calling the shots and the Mughal emperor was doing it. So you could have imagined a situation like Japan with the shogunate, where a very strong military force, in this case the Marathas, consolidates real authority over all of India, leaving, of course, various provincial rulers, as the Mughals did earlier, with a figurehead constitutional monarch who would have been a Mughal. So you would have had a Hindu-Muslim amity in that way as well. And I think that the whole phenomenon that the British promoted of divide and rule would not have happened. Incidentally, we saw that again in 1857 when Hindu and Muslim soldiers fought side by side under the same banner, but under the name of the poor, enfeebled Mughal monarch. He was still the symbol of constitutional authority right up to 1857, which is why the British exiled him to Burma. They had to get him completely out of the country so that he and his descendants could never again become the locus of an alternative power. So I would have seen India emerging as a constitutional monarchy with a strong Japanese-style shogunate kind of Maratha rule, which gradually, with modern communications, railways, modern roads, modern capitalism, etc., would have democratized, as happened to every other country. I don't see our history having been necessarily that much more exceptional. But I certainly don't buy the argument that only the Brits could have united us, because every monarch from Chandragupta onwards had wanted to keep all of India together. And I'm quite convinced that if not the Brits, the Marathas, or whoever else would have done the same thing, because there are many civilizational, cultural, and geographical impulses to Indian unity.
And you might have had someone called Satyajit Rao if that had happened instead of Satyajit Ray, I can assure you. And the Marathas were very close to taking over Bengal.
Sudeep, I have one quibble though. You said we might have been speaking French, but I think if none of these companies had actually dominated us, we'd be sitting here speaking Persian. Because that was the link language till the 1830s. One of the startling things I found when I was doing my first book was when the Travancore Maharani, a Malayali, wrote in the 1810s to the British governor in Madras, the head of the fort there. It was in Persian. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in Malayalam. It was in Persian, even in Kerala, for diplomatic purposes. So yeah, we might have been sitting here speaking Persian. There's someone there with a question, the gentleman with the book. You've got the mic. Okay, let him go first, and then you can after his question, after his.
Can you suggest a historical book to me?
Read his and his. They're both very good.
Diplomatic. Well done.
No, but listen, my serious advice to you is never ask about one historical book. Read many. Read many. And what you should do is, when you're listening to your history teacher in class, if something sparks an interest in you, and you want to know more than the history teacher is telling you, then find a book on that subject. That's what I did. Just recently, a couple of years ago, an uncle of mine found an old notebook of mine from class 10 in St. Xavier's, Calcutta, which was not schoolwork, not classwork, no teacher's corrections, just history essays I wrote for my own satisfaction on subjects that interested me beyond the school books. So I would go to libraries and get books and try and understand and write little essays for myself. And that was, I was 14 years old at that time. You're a little younger than that, but I think you can develop your interest by looking at that. Read what interests you. Don't read something because people tell you should read it. Read what interests you, and you will find your interest growing, and eventually you'll read all the books that you should have read, eventually.
And you'll grow up and become Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you.
My question to dear Tharoor sir, myself Himel Ghosh, I am reading your book, An Era of Darkness. In this book, I was reading one thing that you have explained how the British policies deindustrialized the colonial India, and but still Tata Steel came up and brought India back to the picture. But British left the India to a GDP of 3% from 27%. But nowadays, the Indian economy is again falling back with the GDP and the prediction is 4.8%. So what do you think, what is the Indian potential? Because India is a very large population of youth now. So what do you see India growing back its GDP, and with this wind of division that is just like the colonial era, the divisions are happening again. So what is your opinion?
Well, thank you for that. That was a good. By the way, just a tribute to the sponsors of this festival, Tata Steel, because in fact, since he mentioned them, they are a very remarkable post-colonial story, a rather anti-colonial story, because they fought extremely hard. Jamshedji Tata spent literally 20 years trying to get permissions to establish a steel plant. The British had essentially destroyed Indian steel. India had the world's best steel at one time, what was called in Europe wood steel, which was a corruption of the Kannada word ukku steel. Ukku steel was what had been invented. The Arabs came and borrowed it from us to make the famous Damascus steel. In the early years of the East India Company, when the British soldiers killed an Indian soldier, they would make it a point to dismount and steal his sword, because the steel used on the swords of Indian soldiers was so vastly superior to anything a European soldier had in those days. And the British went about destroying this industry. I mean, they did. And then they imposed exports of British steel, and that too, only British standard specifications could be used in India, etc. I've told the story in a few pages in the book, but one of the things Jamshedji Tata did was to try and revive the steel tradition in India through modern steel making, with all the constraints of imperialism, including having to go to British standard specifications. And finally, in fact, when he was doing it, the British finally conceded after 20 years of fighting, because basically they said the guy's going to fail anyway. And a famous British official, the then chairman of the railway board, said, "I will personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian is capable of producing." I only regret that he didn't live long enough to see British steel, or the remnants of British steel, being acquired by Tata Steel when they took over Chorus in the 1990s. I think that would have sent a nice post-colonial frisson through those who did that. But Jamshedji Tata sadly didn't live to see the first ingot of steel coming out of his factory. His son did, because he perished by the end of that. But coming back to his modern question, which is important, in a place like Calcutta, we are all so politically aware and conscious. I think he's right that we have seen a very unusual phenomenon where a government that first came to power talking about Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas and development has revealed for all to see that development is neither their aptitude nor their priority. They have wrecked the economy with a number of self-inflicted goals, starting with demonetization, probably the stupidest economic blunder since Muhammad bin Tughlaq. They have, which then knocked 2% off the Indian GDP, starting its downward fall. It's also, unfortunately, a government that has wrecked so much that we have a record high unemployment level of the worst of the last 46 years since the bad old days of 1974. We are looking at the world's highest rate of farmer suicides. It's now on every average day in India, while we are celebrating this festival, 31 farmers are committing suicide. That's the crisis in agriculture. Food price inflation has gone up. Some fruits and vegetables, as I'm sure many of you know already, painfully, have gone up by 100%. And on top of that, you're looking at not just unemployment, inflation, and collapse in economic growth, but also a situation where investor confidence couldn't be worse. And then when a man like the Amazon head, Bezos, comes and says he wants to invest $1 billion, the BJP actually sneers at him and tells him his $1 billion is no favor to India, and that he requires further investigation. Now, this kind of mentality is clearly not a development mentality anymore. And it seems to me that what we're seeing is the complete exposure of their genuine agenda, which is social, cultural, majoritarianism, revivalism, call it what you want. It's now all about Hindu Rashtra. And divide and rule, the British have done their job too well. I mean, they have essentially managed to implant in the minds of bigots throughout this country, sadly, the seeds of what this particular political party and government are exploiting to divide us further. I mean, that's why I said that the real tukde gang in this country are the people who are ruling us and dividing this country into bits and pieces on the basis of primordial identities. It's very sad.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, sir. Over here. Sir, my name is Priyanka De. So the modern question that you were asking, which you were telling about, that the cultural response, which is itself more important in just preserving all the prehistoric or the pre-independence evidences over here. Now the question that arises that now the certain extent of the saffronization, they are all trying to remove our cultural, the names of the stations that we find, or the way you were raising the voices in the parliament. I must say that you are the only one that who are being so much active in parliament with 498 questions every time, and also mentioning about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre.
and about the preserving or the starting of the light and sound system. And also you have been telling about the ill effects of what Savarkar had been, and but the party now had been too much supportive about the Savarkar now. So my question is the way this 200-year rule, the way we have able to remove that, a kind of a tyranny. And now at that present moment, when we find that a kind of a colonial effect is still over here, how we are going to remove this sort of colonial effect in our country? This is my question to you.
It's a very good question to which there's no simple answer because, frankly, colonizers didn't only colonize the territory, they colonized our minds as well. And in many ways, a lot of because it was not a revolution but a transfer of power in 1947, a lot of these things continued unchanged. I have in the past, without being remotely a Hindutva apologist, I have asked why we don't teach the Mahabharata and the Ramayana in schools as great epics of our culture. The Europeans teach the Iliad and the Odyssey. Why can't we impart that much of familiarity with our ancient epics to children? It's not as religious texts, but just as part of the cultural tropes that keep us going as a civilization now for a continuous civilization for over 2,000 years. So some of those things, I'm afraid, were a legacy of the Macaulayite attitude. What did he say? That a single shelf of British books is worth more than all the libraries of India and Arabia, quote unquote. I mean, it sounds like an idiot, and he was an idiot, but his racism was part of the explanation for a set of policies which sadly we uncritically continued. Our education system in many ways is still bearing the impress of the colonial era. How do we change that? Through awakening of consciousness, my friend, through reading, writing, speaking, studying afresh. Unfortunately, when that challenge comes from people who actually embody the worst elements of the colonial legacy, the divide and rule policy, casteism, religious bigotry, identity politics, then the need to fight back becomes all the more urgent. I think there is moral urgency to the political debates of today. And that urgency is what I try and demonstrate through my work in Parliament. But as you said, I'm one voice, and we need a broader awakening, particularly amongst the educated classes, people like all of you who read books, attend literary festivals. You've got to care beyond this. I mean, we can't afford to have a situation where the large mass of the public remains disengaged from an attempt to transform what this country was all about.
So just one last.
The mic has already been given.
Just one. See, if here, sir, if oppression and crackdown on dissent are markers of colonialism, the protests that are happening all over the country, every 1 in 3 protesters says that this is a second freedom struggle. So do you think that is a little too far-fetched, or you think of this as an attempt of colonizing by forces inside this country?
No, I think the second freedom struggle argument is not exaggerated because what is going on is an assault on the assumptions of the freedom struggle. You see, our freedom struggle, as you all know, didn't divide on ideological grounds. It wasn't Marxists versus capitalists. It didn't divide on geographical grounds. It wasn't Northerners versus Southerners. It divided on one principle alone. Should religion be the determinant of nationhood? Those who said, yes, my religion is my identity, religion will determine my nationality, that was the idea of Pakistan. They created Pakistan. But Mahatma Gandhi onwards, all the Indian nationalists said, no, religion is not the basis for our struggle. Our struggle is for freedom and dignity and equality for all. And we have fought for everyone's freedom. We will create a free country for everybody. And the Constitution reflects that. What did Dr. Ambedkar talk about? About individual rights, about equality, not about religious identity. I've just, in fact, written a lengthy essay in Open Magazine reviewing a new book on the constitutional debates by a young legal constitutional scholar called Madhav Khosla, in which he demonstrates with quote after quote, line after line, that the essential argument in the making of the Constitution was a rejection of religion as a basis for citizenship in any shape or form, because religious affiliation assumes preset loyalties. If you define people's rights, for example, the British had separate electorates for Muslims, right? Now, what does that mean? That as a Muslim, your political identity is constituted, and therefore, as a Muslim, you will vote differently from a Hindu. Whereas what Ambedkar and all the constitution makers argued was absolutely wrong. They said this is not correct, that we are creating freedom for every individual in India to constitute his or her own political identity by the interplay of political interests and forces in a democracy. That was what the constitution making was all about. That is what is being assaulted. So when people say, well, the CAA merely grants citizenship to a few groups, how does it matter? It matters because for the first time, it introduces citizenship, introduces religion as a determinant of citizenship, and the absence of one religion as a disqualification for citizenship. That's the real challenge with the CAA. Linking it then to the NRC, as the Home Minister did in Parliament in both houses explicitly, made it worse, because he was essentially saying, we will now go through every home in the country saying, who are you, where was your father born? And if you can't prove it, clearly if you belong to one of these 6 religions, which account for 80-odd% of the population, you're going to be okay. But if you are unfortunate enough to belong to the one religion that doesn't have it, the onus will be on you to prove that you deserve to be considered Indian. So if you say, but look, I speak Bengali, but I was born in West Bengal, or my father was born in West Bengal, they'll say, how do we know? How do we know you didn't come from Bangladesh? So if your ration card is not proof, your voter card is not proof, they'll take away your voter card. They'll say, the onus is on you to prove you are. And we're looking at a country where 65% of the population doesn't have documentation for birth certificates. One of the ministers in Mr. Modi's government, a former chief of the army, has gone to court to say that he doesn't have a birth certificate and that the date on which the army records his birth is actually wrong because it was the date given at the time of his school admission and his uncle made up some date. Now, this is the reality of India. If it's a reality for a minister of the government of India, can you imagine some poor Muslim in a slum in Bombay? Can you imagine a rural person? Can you imagine a tribal person having to defend the fact that they are Indians? That is what this government has reduced us to. And so to defy and challenge that becomes a moral burden on every one of us because, and I say this to the non-Muslims in this audience, is this the India that we are proud of, that we want to defend, that we want to speak about to the world? Is this the India we want to pass on to our children? Surely not. We don't want our country to be a place where people are discriminated against because of the way they stretch their hands out to God. That is not India. And it seems to me that if you agree with me, we must all stand together. I'm actually leading a march in Thiruvananthapuram on the 29th, inviting ordinary people to just come with me and march from Swami Vivekananda's statue to Mahatma Gandhi's in the city in order to make the point. Swami Vivekananda, by the way, frequently cited by the BJP. But what did he say in his historic speech in Chicago? He said, I'm proud to belong to a nation that has offered shelter and haven to the persecuted of all nations and faiths. And he talked about the Jews coming, he talked about the Parsis coming and others. The fact is, instead of all nations and faiths, the so-called followers of Vivekananda have reduced it to 3 nations and 6 faiths. Is that, again, India? Is that the proud tradition we want to hold up to? So, yes, it is a freedom struggle.
Good afternoon.
I think we're done with questions. No, they're really getting paranoid about the next session.
Come on, there's so many hands up.
All right, one last question.
Good afternoon, sir. I actually want to know that do you believe that we are still colonized in the sense that we still look up to the West and we try to imitate whatever they're doing? Because recently I read an article about the DGCA, which is one of the biggest regulatory bodies in our country, and about the Boeing 7 MAX, the Boeing MAX incident which took place. The Boeing had taken out a statement that, DGCA is such easy to manipulate people and that they're basically run by monkeys. And that they are, like, we can easily do, like, there's a person stating that, every time I speak to the DGCA, I should give in $1,000 because we can easily manipulate them and Boeing is making tons of money because of me. So, ironically, the DGCA took out a statement stating that we are really listening to what Boeing is saying and that we would actually look into this and try to make ourselves better for Boeing as a company to, just to show that we can help listen to the Boeing company. So that's really weird, like a company, like a country's DGCA, which is so big, like handling millions of populations per year, is trying to listen to what the Boeing company is saying, and that's really weird according to me.
You're right. I mean, that's one example. I mean, obviously, we have all sorts of Indians. We're a big and diverse country, and there are some Indians who prefer to be obnoxious to the whites in ways which are also quite silly. Ideally, we should just be ourselves and not have chips on our shoulder, nor should we want to emulate, but we do. And one of the ironies is, of course, that the country is dominated by a political movement born in the 1920s out of the same impulses as movements in Europe, often animated by the same ideologies and the same thinking, and sometimes by the same personnel. You should read about a lady called Savitri Devi, who was actually born with a European name that I now forget, Manu will probably know it, who came to India and became a great advocate of Hindutva. And Savarkar wrote an introduction to her book, arguing the sort of Hitlerian case for Aryan domination and so on. Now, all those ideologies of ethnic purity and racial domination and race pride have been completely discredited in Europe, indeed eradicated by and large. But in India, they're still carrying on in the form of our ruling party and its ideologues. That is the irony of if you like, the colonizing of the Indian mind that you asked about. Because we are not just learning the wrong things in the West, we're learning things the West has given up decades ago, and we're still trying to apply them here.
We've managed to get from an unstable Robert Clive to, there's far too many people, no, I can't. Okay, quick.
At the beginning. I'm very gratified here. I think it's obviously only in Bengal that it would be on the syllabus, since elsewhere I'm sure that the author's name alone would be enough to keep the book far away from. But I'm delighted you have it. And the honest, I mean, the book A seeks to be self-contained as an argument, but B has, I've forgotten, 50-odd pages of footnotes, so there's plenty more of additional substantiation available. As Manu points out, there are some who quibble with some of my arguments, particularly one side or the other. So by all means, encourage your students to do further reading, because even those who disagree with me are in the footnotes, and they can form their own opinions and share them with you. I mean, the truth is that there's an awful lot worth thinking about, it seems to me, in this period. What Sudeep is writing, what Manu has written, of course, much more about the periods before that, but even during the colonial period, there's so much of material now coming out. And what's striking is the amount of original research Indians are doing. And I would urge your students, by all means, read my book or anybody else's, but then try and read beyond, especially read things that challenge so they can get counter narratives and judge for themselves which they prefer. And that's how we all came to our opinions, and your students should do the same thing.
It would be really discourteous to the next panel. They're waiting, that's the only thing. But since you're a schoolboy, it's emotionally difficult also. Okay, go ahead, quickly. Quick.
Yeah. He's asking whether today's politics is taking us back 70 years. Actually, they're trying to take us back to the 19th century. So you should be grateful it's only 70 years.
Thank you very much. And we hand it back to you now, finally.
No, I would please request our delegates to stay on stage as Dr. Hari Prasad Kanoria, Chairman, Shrey Foundation, wishes to felicitate them, not only on behalf of Shrey, but on behalf of all of us here. So if I may please have Dr. Kanoria up on stage. Just a minute, please. And my next panel will be up in about 2 minutes. This wonderful session on Colony India books and the idea of India was brought to you by Shrey.
It is my honor to propose a vote of thanks to all the writers and intellectuals and book lovers of Kolkata. The Kolkata Literary Meet has become integral part of City of Joy since last several years. By their intellectual presence, we understand and we are inspired to be intellectuals, more intellectuals. And as you know, there is a saying, that pen is mightier than the sword. Pen is mightier than the sword. So the intellectuals can inspire and can change the entire world scenario, the economic of the country, GDP growth and all that. In his book, Dr. Tharoor has mentioned that India was called the bird of gold, Soni ki chidiya. At that time, India contribution was 53%. And after the British, it has come down to 3%. And I am glad that some boy has asked, audience has asked about the present GDP and all that. And Dr. Tharoor has answered very nicely of that. About the education, value in education has deteriorated. And I found in Boston University and other city of America, they are teaching their theology about all the religions they are teaching. But in our education system, there is no theology course. So when we say we are secular, then how we can secular without knowing the essence of all the religions? We must know about all the essence of all the religions. I hope all of you have enjoyed their talks. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you. And all our authors will be available at the festival bookstore to sign their books. Sorry about the volume there. We have a small token of gratitude for our delegates from Tata Steel, the title sponsor of the Kolkata Literary Meet. Since its inception over a century ago, Tata Steel has committed to sustainable development and effective management of the environment in and around its operations. This bonsai plant, if we can please have our people coming up. Okay, so the delegates will be given bonsai plants by Tata Steel. This is part of Tata Steel's resolve of enabling a better tomorrow, as well as their appreciation and thanks for your contribution to the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet. The plants will not make their appearance on stage right now, but they will be handed to our delegates off stage. Thank you so much.